start our exploration of, pardon me, the ethics of forgiveness. As has been as we have seen in JLI courses, those who are with me in the fall, we can usually summarize we can distill the lesson into a sentence. So we can say here, forgive and forget, and now everyone can go home. But I know that's not what you were here for, and as is always the case, just because things can be explained more directly and simplistically doesn't mean that it should. In general, we would probably all say, when is the Jewish day of forgiveness or atonement? Yom Kippur, and that is correct, one day a year. What is interesting, though, is that there is a mitzvah of repentance, teshuvah. That's a little bit different than forgiveness. The Hebrew word for forgiveness is mechila, which means the process of forgiveness. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement, which happens once a year. Teshuvah, this idea of asking for forgiveness or attempting to return, exists every single day. In part of the Amidah prayer, which is recited morning, afternoon, and night, there is the expression, there is a blessing dedicated to the idea of teshuvah. Every day we say Hashivenu, God, help us return. The same way, the blessing which immediately follows that one is Salach lanu avinu ki chatanu, forgive us, God, because we have sinned. Very often the idea of confession or asking for forgiveness is accompanied by banging our hands over our hearts. So the idea is not just once a year, the idea is not even necessarily once a day. There's a general idea that there is a value to forgive. Obviously to err is human, to forgive is divine. Following in God's footsteps will certainly have a piece of what we are doing here. There is a clip. I'm going to attempt to show the clip, just to get your sense of this. Let's see if it works. It's an experiment. Let's see if I actually have sound. Sometimes it's a little bit too much for me to experiment. It's too much for me to experiment with technology in the first place. But all right, so now I know I can run let's see if I can find the sound. Yeah. No, but it's something.
Fancy.
All right, I think it's going to get very loud. Maybe you may want to cover your ears. Let's see. You'll have to take my word for it. It's a great video. I'll send it to everybody afterwards. But the gist of the video ask the basic question similar to Simon Wiesenthal. So you can look at it from the slide perspective. Simon Wiesenthal, who is the famous Nazi hunter, there's a center named after him, which is dedicated to tolerance and peace and morality. That as a concentration camp inmate, he was there was a soldier whose conscience was torturing him, and this SS soldier, wanted to be forgiven. In the long nights while I had been waiting for death, I have longed to talk to a Jew and beg forgiveness from him. Ought I to have forgiven him? Is the question that Simon Wiesenthal poses in his memoirs. So, ought he? Yeah?
I got a basic question. This notion of forgiveness, I mean, if somebody does something wrong, they've done something wrong, forgiveness doesn't, take the deed away.
No.
I mean, it just means that one particular person won't hold a resentment against you? Is that what it means?
I don't know. I'm just posing the questions. I'm listening. What do you think?
I kind of wonder, I mean, there's a notion of resentments on one hand. Does it mean that you have a resentment if you don't forgive? If I'm not going to interact with anybody and I did something wrong and I atoned for it, maybe I...
You seem to have thought about this a lot.
Actually, in another context, I definitely
No,
have.
I think, look, if it's something that appears in our services 3 times a day, we have a whole day over the course of the year. Okay, so there's a lot to it. But what about Wiesenthal? Yeah.
Well, I think Wiesenthal's answer was no, that he didn't, and I think the answer was that if he really had teshuva, God would be the one.
Actually, interesting. You know what his answer was?
I thought it was no.
No, he left. There was no answer. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no, he just
But he
silent.
didn't forgive him.
Correct, but this is a subtle difference. One is proactively either granting or rejecting. It was sort of a question mark. He didn't really know what to say, so he left. The video clip was one of a woman, one of what were known as the Mengele twins. Right? The Nazi doctor Mengele, Joseph Mengele, performed experiments, horrific experiments, especially on twins. And one of the Mengele twins, very famously in a return visit to Auschwitz, says, I forgive the Nazis. And it started a bit of an uproar in terms of, first of all, how can you forgive the Nazis? It's very nice of you to forgive Nazis, but what about everybody else? How can you grant forgiveness for everybody? In general, this is sort of, it raises the issue in terms of situations that are horrific. Are there times where we don't have to forgive? Are there times where we should not forgive? This clearly would rank high on that list of questionable offenses warranting forgiveness or not. And it sort of begs the question in terms of, are there situations that go beyond our ability to grant forgiveness? What do we say about the person who asks for forgiveness? What's harder, to ask for forgiveness or to forgive?
To forgive. To forgive because you're asking, I mean, it could go either way. I mean, a person could say yes or no, if a person is asking. But
All right, okay.
it could go either way.
Anyone think differently in terms of why it's more difficult to forgive or more? Anyone disagree? Yeah?
I think it's harder to, for myself anyway, it's harder to ask
Right.
for forgiveness. That entails an implicit notion that I was wrong in the first place.
All right, so someone who said, okay, David is saying it's harder to ask for forgiveness. I will be honest, when I posed the question to you, I was thinking from the place, I think it's also very difficult to ask for forgiveness. Especially if sort of the person doesn't know that you did the wrong thing to them. Sort of all of a sudden reopening up an old wound. You may not know about how badly I spoke of you behind your back. I did it, but if I'm asking you for forgiveness, now you will. So, okay, I think both, there's something to be said for. But let's look at a couple of case studies. One Talmudic, one taken from the headlines, not necessarily newspaper headlines, but one taken from an exploration. Let's look at text number 1, or case study number 1. Right, this is from the Talmud.
Page 49.
It's on page 49. Once Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, was coming from Migdal Gedor, from the house of his teacher. He rode along the riverside on his donkey and felt happy and proud because he had studied much Torah. He chanced upon an exceedingly ugly man who greeted him, "Peace be upon you, my master." Rabbi Elazar did not return his greeting, but instead said to him, "Empty one, how ugly you are! Are all the people of your city as ugly as you?" "I do not know," said the man, "but go to the craftsman who made me and say to him, how ugly is the vessel you have made." Realizing that he had done wrong, Rabbi Elazar dismounted from his donkey, prostrated himself before the man, and said to him, "I misspoke, forgive me." But the man replied, "I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me and say to him, how ugly is the vessel that you have made." So the strings attached to the granting of forgiveness. Rabbi Elazar kept walking after him until he reached his city. The residents of the city came to greet him. They came to greet Rabbi Elazar, saying, "Peace be upon you, O teacher, O master." Said the man who had been insulted to them, "Who are you calling master?" Said they, "The person walking behind you." Said he to them, "If this is a master, may there not be any more like him in Israel." Why, asked the people. Said, the man, he has done such and such to me. Nevertheless, forgive him, said they, for he is a man greatly learned in the Torah. For your sakes I will forgive him, said the man, but only if he does not act this way anymore. Right? So, should the rabbi ask for forgiveness in a case like this? Right, it's not a trick question. Yes, you can call somebody ugly to their face. Yeah, if it's behind the back, that would be more, Lashon Hara maybe, like Rechilos that we saw last week, right? But should the ugly man have granted it? Yeah.
Okay, first, I think instead of asking for forgiveness, the rabbi should atone for what he did, but he shouldn't be giving something to get something back. Asking for forgiveness is basically saying, okay, I did something wrong, forgive me. Well, that you should give it unconditionally.
Well, so there's been too many pronouns. The rabbi asked for forgiveness. So
Yeah,
you're
I'm saying, I think that is an unclean act.
Who unclean
By
act
the
is
act,
what?
by the rabbi.
Okay,
Because
all
he's
right.
basically saying, I'm basically going to say I'm wrong, but I want you to tell me you forgive me. As opposed to saying I did something wrong, I'm sorry.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Any other reactions? I must say, I thought the rabbi did the right thing. I thought the person did the wrong thing. The person says, I'm only going to forgive you, but first you have to tell God that he made me wrong. The rabbi's very, you're okay. The rabbi has a bit of an attitude, and he thinks the guy's ugly, and he said so. And he realizes that he said the wrong thing because the man took offense. And so all he says is, okay, I'm sorry, I misspoke, forgive me. The rabbi just asked for forgiveness. It's the person who he wronged who says, well, no, I will forgive you, but only if...
He's the wrong, yeah, he made a mistake,
Okay.
no question about it,
All
but
right.
they're two separate deals.
Okay, yeah.
I think there was also pressure put on him, because here's this rabbi who really makes a comment that he had no business making, that really hurt somebody else. The man is going about his business, he's getting pressure from people saying, well, he's a wonderful rabbi, he's a great teacher, you should forgive
I
him.
wonder what that's like for people to say he's a good But, okay, no,
But you've never done anything to harm him.
That's true, that's true. But you sort of see, so you have the rabbi making a mistake. You have the person saying, I'll forgive you, but rabbi, you have to do X first. You want to be forgiven? Okay, you're going to have to work for it. Not only that, you're sort of, more broadly speaking, this granting of forgiveness ultimately in the end was, okay, because you're giving me a hard time, I'll forgive you. Was it ever even genuine? Well, it seems that the forgiveness is less than genuine. The remorse of the rabbi, genuine, not genuine? Thoughts? Genuine, he made a mistake, okay, if he should keep his aesthetic sensibilities about what other people look like to himself. So there seems, that is issue number one, that's the Talmudic precedent about the case. What about, yeah.
Well, is it a possibility, the fact that this is from the Talmud, that the rabbi didn't mean to say ugly? It was a different word. He meant to say whatever.
Right, I don't hate, I extremely dislike. No, there was an insult. It's like saying,
It wasn't.
it's like your mother, it's, that's what was going on there. Yeah.
I hope you don't mind, I just want to take a step back. Can you define what it means to forgive? Does it mean,
Okay.
Does it
All
mean
right.
somebody who has the capacity
Mhm.
to absolve a person from all wrongdoing? Or does it mean partially? Does it mean to turn the other cheek, so to speak, in a different...
Now you know why the class is more than forgive and forget. Let's go home.
Because until you really define what that means, you ask, should somebody do something, there are many levels of which one could
Right, does
theoretically
he,
forgive.
okay.
And
All
so,
right.
so it's not a really...
We know forgiveness from a religious standpoint, but what exactly does that mean? What comes to mind, Seinfeld episode. Step 9. Anyone see that one?
Oh, yeah.
George Costanza is upset that someone is going through a process that requires, one of the steps is that that's to atone. And he feels that he's being ignored because there was a time that he borrowed this guy's sweater and wanted to borrow this guy's sweater. The guy said, no, you can't have it because your big head is going to stretch out the neck hole. So he feels he was wronged. He feels that was an insult. And the person who is asking for forgiveness doesn't feel he did anything wrong. So you can sort of, what makes it something? Oh, just because I feel wrong, does that mean you have to ask for forgiveness? Do you know that it's not just in terms of what is forgiveness, but what does it mean to wrong someone? All right, we're not going to we're not going to necessarily go through, is my fear that you'll stretch my neck hole an actionable offense that requires pardon or not, but let's look at something a little bit more severe. Case study number 2 on page 52. I'm worried about my mom, the sweet young college student told me after I gave a guest lecture in her family studies class. My dad was abusive toward her. They've been divorced for 12 years, but she won't forgive him. My brothers and sisters and I keep telling her she really ought to, but she refuses. As we talked, the young woman revealed that her mother has made a splendid life for herself, run a successful business, and joined the company of her large circle of friends. More importantly, her father has never asked to be forgiven. He's never acknowledged that he was wrong, never repented, never tried to make things right. I asked her why, under the circumstance, she believes that her father's entitled to forgiveness. She looked a bit blank and then replied earnestly, "Isn't it unhealthy? I thought you couldn't go on in life unless you forgive the people who hurt you." So you have a situation where, it is somewhat of a question in terms of, she won't forgive him. Isn't it unhealthy to hold back a grudge? To sort of, here the idea of forgiveness is for the benefit of the wrong party. How can you live with this sort of unresolved? Just forgive, and then you'll be able to move on. Yeah.
I once heard somebody say that having a resentment is like drinking poison and thinking it's going to kill the other person.
Okay.
So I don't know about forgiving, but certainly letting go of a resentment seemed like a good idea.
But it sort of opens the question, what does it mean to forgive if you're still going to be resentful? It's a question. I'm not saying that that's, Any other thoughts? Should the mother be convinced to forgive?
No.
No? Okay, so it seems, why not?
Because she made peace with her life and she went on.
Okay. All right. You know what? These things happen. To explore or even to acknowledge the harm and the hurt by forgiving the perpetrator is reopening an old wound. Why do it? You could also say he's not interested in being forgiven, so why should she take the step forward and forgive what would seem to be a horrific offense?
It's obviously not on the forefront of her mind either.
Okay, correct. She's been able to go on. Any other thoughts?
You're defining forgiveness as being somebody who has taken the initial steps to want to
Okay.
do it in the first place. And if they don't, then it takes on a different
Okay.
definition.
So I think we have, I would summarize that we're hearing that don't forgive. Time has gone by. There's no one has asked for the forgiveness. It doesn't seem to be worthwhile to reopen old wounds. On the other hand, as Larry, you point out, forgive, but who says you have to give up the resentment? Maybe there's just something about granting or offering forgiveness which does have a value, even if it's not going to heal what took place in the past.
What I guess I'm really saying is, having resentment, okay, another phrase, having resentment against someone is like letting them live rent-free in their head. Why should you do it? So certainly letting go of a resentment is a good thing to do, such as praying for them or something like that. Might be a good way to make that happen.
So
that doesn't mean you have to
So
go
let's
approach
talk.
them
I
and
think we need to
forgive
talk a little bit more about terms, getting to Craig's point in terms of what is forgiveness and what does it mean to forgive and the like. So let's look from a Jewish perspective at what we know as the time for forgiveness, Yom Kippur. On page 54, text 1a, on this day God will atone for you and purify you of all of your transgressions before God. You will become pure. And the Talmud and the Mishnah on this points out that all your transgressions before God you will become pure. So this means that it's only the sins between a person and God. Yom Kippur does not atone for transgressions between one person and another until the offender placates the victims. So we have to talk about for a second this idea of the limits of Yom Kippur. Man and God. Yom Kippur atones for transgressions between a person and God. It does not work for sins between one person and another until the offender placates the victim. So we begin by saying, you need to ask. And now this is not necessarily agreed to by all. Look at text number 2. Someone will please read. Okay?
One must ask forgiveness of the aggrieved party. This personal encounter is a sign or known when it comes to sins between two human beings. A number of years ago on 60 Minutes, Mike Wallace interviewed Chuck Colson, former head of the Nixon White House plumbers, for Watergate-era dirty trick. Wallace asked Colson, who, while in jail, had become a devout Christian, if he felt any need to go to the people whose lives he so severely dislocated and apologize to them. No, Colson answered. I have made peace with God in my heart. This is in striking contrast to Teshuvah, which calls for going to the wrong party first. Judaism believes that it is only through human interaction that the victim can best be healed and the wrongdoer most profoundly changed. Making peace with God comes later. By forcing a face-to-face encounter with the aggrieved party, Jewish tradition teaches that sin is not a generalized, amorphous act, but something quite specific done against a particular person or group of people.
So there's the idea introduced, here, just because Chuck Colson responded this way doesn't mean he represents all of Christianity, but as someone who connected with the Christian faith, he felt that, no, I've made peace with it. God will take whatever steps are necessary. There's no need for me to take any action. Judaism says no. The person who does the wrong has to take the action. And it's not even, it doesn't say that, it's not even so much about asking. If you look at the end of the last sentence in text 1b, what happens? Yom Kippur does not atone for those transgressions until the offender placates the victim. Do you forgive me for what I did wrong to you? Isn't enough. It's a technical point that is essential, but it's not enough. There needs to be some sort of, there has to be the creation of some sort of sense of peace. Otherwise, it's not yet completely, it's not complete atonement yet. And that is, it goes beyond just sort of, do you forgive me? There's sort of this, the idea on, in the laws of the high holidays, it talks about people should ask each other for forgiveness. So it sort of ultimately creates, do you forgive me? I forgive you. It's sort of like, it's like a go down the line. You forgive me, I forgive you. It's sort of almost sort of automatic. It's a nice gesture. And we don't take away from any of the gestures that are trying to create a sense of peace between one and the other, but it's missing something if it doesn't go beyond the sort of first step. It's not even about repaying damages. If you look at text number 3, we talked a lot about damages last week, but on page 56, someone who injures another is obliged to pay on 5 accounts: damage, pain, medical bills, loss of employment, and embarrassment. Even when the attacker issues these payments, God does not grant atonement until the offender asks the victim for forgiveness. It's not enough to just make things right or make the person whole again. There's something that transcends the technical nature. And remember, it's not, sometimes the idea talks about easing the pain, not just physical pain. Even after easing any sort of emotional pain, there's still the need to try and rectify the relationship. From a Jewish perspective, that is the idea of forgiveness. So it's not just technical things. Yom Kippur is about, Judaism views actionable offenses, those that are just by words. You sort of insult someone. The example in the Talmud highlights the fact that calling somebody ugly, well, that's an actionable offense. Even if there isn't even if the person isn't even bothered by it. That's emotional pain. Sticks and stones may break my bones. The names will never hurt me. So I'll go get some sticks and stones, and then we'll restart this encounter. But it highlights that Judaism sees a need for something. It needs something more. So let's go back to our case studies. So I think we would agree that in both of them, there was an offense that required asking for forgiveness. What about should we haven't yet answered? Should forgiveness have been granted? What about this idea of the person sort of saying, "No, I'm not going to forgive you"? What about that type of an attitude? Let's talk a little about the person's reluctance. Let's leave the second example, which involves abuse, aside for a moment, but the case where a rabbi called him ugly and he asked for forgiveness, the guy says no.
Be reasonable.
Huh?
Could be reasonable.
Could be reasonable, okay.
I think on first account, it's appropriate almost.
Okay, you should make the guy sweat a little bit.
Well, you know, to make it a meaningful understanding, it's not something that would be an immediate response, and
Okay.
there ought to be a certain,
So text number 5 highlights something which you may have heard with regard to forgiveness, the idea of asking multiple times. One of the rules, especially with regards to Yom Kippur, where this rule is stated, is that if you have to be willing to continue to go back and ask for forgiveness. At least 3 times, and then ideally until the answer changes. After a 3rd attempt, the offender need not pursue the matter any longer, but it's still a nice thing. They talk about sort of what does it mean to not forgive. We'll have to talk about that. In general, we should be forgiving. I think that sort of goes without saying, but maybe there are times where we shouldn't be forgiving. But just in terms of the person who must ask for forgiveness, it's any sort of actionable item. It goes beyond just repaying the person or making them whole again. It's something that can impact a person even in words, even in ways that don't seem to be as tangible. And you have to pursue forgiveness multiple times. Yeah?
Have we defined forgiveness yet?
Well, forgiveness, it seems to be some sort of, on some level, well, we haven't defined the various levels. No, we have not given it could be just sort of, I forgive you, but we haven't yet explored what happens if a guy just says, I forgive you. It would seem to need to be something more. When it comes to trying to sort of take these steps, there would seem to be, on the one hand, the need for the person who does the wrong to acknowledge that you did something wrong in the first place. Any of us who work with children know sort of convincing a youngster that what they did was wrong is really the first step towards correcting behavior. And then it requires some form of acceptance of an apology on the other side. In many ways, it's sort of the need, when you look at what it was that led to this transgression. Talmud, when it comes to Rabbi Lazar, if you look back in the text, it tells us his name, his father's name, his travel details. It tells us about his emotions. It also tells us about his actions. What does it tell us about the ugly man? You can go back and check. I'll give it away. It tells us that he's ugly. Doesn't really give us any information whatsoever. It's certainly by design, especially to highlight the lesson that what allowed Rabbi Lazar to call the man ugly is that that's how he saw him. He saw him just exclusively as an object. He didn't think about the other components of the person. He didn't think about that this was a person who came from a place and had a father, maybe had a family. Didn't think it was a person with a life experience. Didn't think it was someone who had experience that was parallel to his own. But he objectified him, and therefore it was something that, okay, what he saw was what he described. You're ugly. There's no sort of there was no sort of parallel exploration of the person. And the Talmud highlights that by just giving us the information about Rabbi Lazar, not giving us the information about the person. The idea that what the details that the Talmud displays is highlighting for us how at times these types of insults or sins towards the other can take place. The idea that, well, if you genuinely saw the other person as someone deserving of respect, it wouldn't happen. We've touched upon this theme in previous courses. We've touched upon it in the full course with regards to sin. The idea that a person only sins when the spirit of foolishness enters. It was the Talmudic expression we explored. the general inclination of a person is to do the right thing. So when you sort of ignore your, you ignore Jiminy Cricket, that's when it becomes possible to look at people in a negative sense. The idea.
I was gonna say, it seems like you were just telling the truth. It seems like you were just telling the truth.
Correct. If that's all the person was, if the person only was just, okay, someone who's in, his whole role is, is he aesthetically pleasing or is he ugly? Oh, that's all he did. He didn't think about anything else. And what we're looking for is to understand the person a little bit more in depth. If the other person has the same thoughts and feelings and can be hurt the same way I could be hurt, then there is the ability to try and begin to mend fences. This idea of looking at the seeking forgiveness is not just do you forgive me, it has to come with a parallel attempt to, once again, identify why the mistake was made and correct the undercurrent. If it's about being insensitive, well, then you have to be more sensitive. If it's about something that was done impulsively, you break someone's stuff, well, you have to exert self-control to once again restore, to avoid having the mistake happen again. Very famously, in the repentance process, they talk about you need to recognize the sin, you need to atone for the sin, and you need to commit to never do it again. Now, if I would fulfill all of this, then I should never ever sin again. Either that, or when I committed never to sin again, I was a liar. No, the idea is just because the goal is to conceptualize that, no, I made a mistake, I don't want to make this mistake again. Now, the fact that I will make the mistake again, thankfully, we have a forgiving God and a Day of Atonement in this whole process. But I have to be willing to at least say, I'm not going to make the same mistake again.
It's awareness.
It's
awareness.
It's awareness.
Cognitive behavior.
Correct. Well, we had it first. Before they had those fancy terms, we had it. But there is that concept. So let's talk a little bit. That's what's expected from the person who does wrong. What's expected from the victim, and that will help us understand what is forgiveness. And we're talking about on my side. I made the mistake. What I'm supposed to be doing in an attempt to correct it. Well, what are you thinking? Or what are the forces at play on the side of the victim that contributes to forgiveness? Yes?
That always struck me as a little bit weak when we say that you have to verbally commit to not doing a certain sin again, or making that same hurtful error again, because human fallibility being what it is, it's easy to say that you'll never do this, and then it comes up again. It seems to me that it would be much more sincere and effective if you had to commit to actually, coming up with a system for not doing it, but that never seems to be rooted.
There is a system. It's called mitzvahs. It's called the right thing. I thought you were going to suggest that instead of just committing not to do the wrong thing, we would sort of wear one of these collars that gave us electric shocks.
See, that's a system. That would mean something.
All right. Well, I think that the way we look at things is that we look at people as having the same potential to follow through in their commitments as electric shocks. Maybe we place too much faith in man, but that's ideally what we're expecting. We expect people to do the right thing. Oh well, Judaism is a very optimistic religion. And in general, the idea of looking at man as having this potential is the only way we'll be able to, find meaning. So what is expected from the what is expected of the victim? So let's look at text number 6. Rav was once reciting verses of a scriptural passage before Rebbe. Rabbi Chia entered, so Rav started again from the beginning. Bar Kapara entered, so he started again from the beginning. Rabbi Shimon, son of Rebbe, entered, so he started again from the beginning. Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama entered. Rav said, remember, Rav said, must we keep on going back so many times? He didn't go back. So Rabbi Chanina took offense. You're not going back, start from the beginning? Rav went to him on the day before Yom Kippur for 13 years, but he would not be pacified. The Talmud asked, how could Rabbi Chanina behave thusly? Did not Rava say those who pardon matters of personal slight have all their transgressions pardoned? So how could he do it? What are some thoughts? What are some of the things we see from this episode?
7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
So it sort of says here, how could you ask for forgiveness if you can't forgive other people? How?
Okay, you have that, okay, there seems to be a correlation. If you are forgiving, you will be forgiven.
Or how could you even ask for forgiveness if you're not willing to forgive?
Okay, all right. Anything else? Does Judaism expect a person to forgive?
Yeah.
Always? That's a lot of Yom Kippurs for not, going back to the beginning. That's why now I'm trying to take the class, so no one will ever have to.
Judaism says we have to forgive every Jew, and we gotta do it every
I
night.
don't know about that.
What about the bedtime Shema?
We'll talk about the bedtime Shema in a few minutes, but here,
Sorry.
here, Rabbi Hanina was not very forgiving, and he's a rabbi no less, and he's not forgiving.
So you never read the bedtime Shema?
Well, I think he did, and I think that there is something to be said that maybe there is not necessarily the expectation for someone to forgive, and we can see that because there are certain exceptions that the Talmud and Jewish codes recognize in terms of forgiveness. So, for example, in sincerity, if it's sort of, do you forgive me, I forgive you, or it's Yom Kippur, forgive me, right? Talmud has a famous expression that a person is going to say, you know what, I'm going to do something wrong because, I expect the other person to forgive me. And we'll come back to the bedtime Shema, and if you're not familiar with what Larry is referring to, you'll see in a minute. I'll do whatever I want, because I'm just going to assume that everyone's going to say the bedtime Shema and grant blanket forgiveness. That's not necessarily sincere. There are situations when there's harm. If the forgiveness will cause the victim some sort of harm, even indirectly, well, the idea of if a person can't be forced to forgive if doing so will cause emotional distress. So think of an abuse situation where someone was abused, and then to say to that person, well, Judaism says you have to forgive your abuser, is a little bit extreme. Not a little bit, it is extreme. It's wrong. Another exception has to do with to teach a lesson. Sometimes people need to be taught that they can't just go about sinning and expecting to achieve forgiveness. The idea of some people look at the situation of Yosef and his brothers. That does Joseph ever forgive his brothers? From his behavior, it would seem yes, but there was never really the full granting of forgiveness. It's just sort of an interesting situation. Sometimes he clearly didn't forgive them at first because he makes them jump through hoops. Why did he just forgive them? He wanted to teach them something. So it can be part of a grand plan. Slander. We talked about slander last week. There are certain sins which you don't have to forgive. The Talmud says one of them is slander. Why is it slinging a lot of slander? Because of its danger. We saw last week how seemingly innocuous information can be dangerous. So therefore, you don't have to forgive slander. If you don't have to forgive slander, we can envision certain sins which are probably much worse than slander that don't have to be forgiven. And the fifth is when forgiving is improper. And that would go back to the situation of Simon Wiesenthal, or the whole dispute or the discussion about the woman, the Mengele twin, who forgave the Nazis publicly. It's not, you can't forgive certain offenses, especially if there's sort of, people are seeking, the Nazis are seeking forgiveness. Well, who's going to grant them that forgiveness? The 6 million plus Jews who are dead. One example in Jewish laws they talk about, if someone sins against someone who has died, and they never had asked that person for forgiveness, they talk about going to the grave of the person to seek forgiveness. The idea that the sins outlast the grave. But so there clearly are exceptions in Jewish tradition where you don't have to forgive. So let's go back to the case studies. Can we justify the ugly man's refusal to forgive based on any of the 5 exceptions?
at the least A, the insincerity.
If you see the exceptions again.
The insincerity.
Okay. Was the rabbi sincere? Any other thoughts?
Teaching a lesson.
Teach a lesson. I think that can be applied as well. All right. Forgiveness was asked directly of the victim. No harm would be done through forgiving. Not a case of slander. It's an insult, but it's not slander. But he may have felt the rabbi was insincere. And maybe he could teach the rabbi a lesson, or teach a lesson to posterity. What about the wife's refusal to forgive based on any of the 5 exceptions?
Harm.
Okay, harm.
Insincerity?
I go one step further than insincerity.
He didn't even bother.
Huh?
He didn't
He didn't even bother that. It was the daughter worried about her mental health because of it. He didn't seek a reason to grant. And certainly the sin itself, even had he sought forgiveness, would not necessarily warrant granting forgiveness. So the idea of seeking forgiveness, the idea of recognizing that the quest for forgiveness is something, it's a religious imperative. It is a religious imperative that stems from the need to try and correct a mistaken approach to the person in the first place, and the idea of trying to correct that. What about the one who to grant forgiveness? Well, you know what? That person does not necessarily have to grant forgiveness. It seems that the goal should always be to seek forgiveness, and if you don't seek, then something is lacking. Being forgiving is a nice thing, but you don't always have to grant forgiveness because some sins don't necessitate, don't warrant it for various reasons. Those are the exceptions that we saw. So what about going a little bit deeper into the role of the victim? Why or how does Jewish law expect a person to sort of forego their hurt feelings for the sake of the other person? And think of this, whether you want to look at the case study or in general. I do something wrong to you. I now am going to try to correct it. The fact that I'm trying to correct it means you have to meet me halfway, even if you don't really want to. So how can that be? Why is that fair? Sort of, it's almost like I win here because I did something wrong. I try. I've had growth. This has been a growing experience for me. Now please forgive me. And you, who were called ugly, or were the victim of an atomic wedgie, or whatever their sin may have been, now have to forgive me. It sounds like you're getting the short end of the stick, and I'm the more mature person. I've learned from my experience, and you're there dealing with the scars of whatever the offense was. How can Jewish law expect one to forego his or her feelings? Yes.
Because if there's no expectation that somebody's going to have the possibility of being able to be forgiven, then one will never go through the process of asking for forgiveness, and then there would never be any type of civility among people, or the process of I guess whatever you want to call healing is. There has to be some ability or knowledge that the person who will ask for forgiveness has the capacity, will have that opportunity to be forgiven.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
I think this is being presented, not you presenting, but I think the way the framework is confusing, and I think it's...
Well, that's why we're going to define, we're now going to finally answer David's question. We have to define what Judaism is expecting out of forgiveness. Until this point, it sort of almost sounds like turning the other cheek. Okay, so basically, Christianity has this theme, the concept that if I smack you, what should be your response? Turn the other cheek and let me smack that side. And that was always, when I was in Israel, post-high school, there was a seminar that was sort of how to respond to Christian missionaries. And one of them was this idea that when they present to you various biblical proof texts, including from the book of Isaiah, texts that are important to Jews as being proof that Christianity is accurate, you're supposed to respond to them with, oh, so this is, you believe in these principles, Christians believe in turning the other cheek, right? And they would advise, so smack the guy. And then when the guy gets all angry, he says, no, you have to let me smack your other cheek. I never implemented this. I'm not really sure if I would approve of its pedagogical value today. But it does sound a little bit unfair to sort of expect a person to forego his or her feelings. And with that, let's look at what does forgiveness mean and how would you define it? Look on page 60.
I just want to add one thing.
Yeah.
I also think that this concept of confession just sort of eliminates and erases any wrongdoing as well. So there's no forced
You're talking
recognition.
Christianity?
Well, unless you want confession from me, yes.
Okay. Well, look, it's always, pretty easy. Confess the sins. I killed somebody. Okay, a couple of Hail Marys and you're done. That's great. But that's not our lot. So look at some of these definitions. What does forgiveness mean? How would you define it? So these are all possible. Everything, all of the above. All of the above and other. Okay, look at text number 7. There are multiple levels of forgiveness. Among them, the victim forgives in the sense that the victim desires that the offender should not suffer divine punishment. The victim might still harbor animosity toward the offender, but has been mitigated to the extent that the victim desires that no harm befall the offender. All right, so that's one level of forgiveness. Whatever you did to me, okay, I still bear the grudge to some extent, but I don't want someone to do that to you. That's some form of connection, some form of acknowledgement. One forgives to the degree that one harbors no animosity toward the offender. Moreover, in such a scenario, the victim desires good for the offender. The victim will even do whatever possible to further this good, yet the relation between the two parties is not as it was before the offense. So you can have a proactive, a positive relationship with the person who has wronged you, but something is still missing. Or the victim is completely appeased and therefore forgives wholeheartedly. The relation between offender and victim is exactly as it was before the offense. Right? This could be, I imagine this is probably more likely when the offense is quite minor. But what we see is that the process of mechila, which is the Hebrew term for forgiveness, can have on one level restoring the relationship between two individuals. It's not about forgiving and forgetting, right? There still is a whole lot in the background, but it's the idea that the two people acknowledge each other, right? So there's the story where in the family, the father does something very, very stupid, and the mother gets very upset and screams, and a whole argument breaks out in front of the kids, and the father apologizes, and they make up, and it seems that tranquility is restored once again. Every now and then, the wife reminds the husband, honey, don't forget about, there's just sort of, with a little bit of an allusion to the previous eruption. So the husband says, why do you keep bringing that up? I thought we had moved beyond that. What about forgive and forget? So she says, sure, we moved on from that. I just don't want you or me to forget what exactly it is that I have forgiven and forgotten. So the idea that there's a relationship, but there can still be a whole lot of baggage behind it. The idea of the spectrum for mechila, not one size fits all. Sometimes it's utilitarian. It doesn't necessarily lead to real reconciliation. Sometimes there is a need for two people to operate together for different causes. Sometimes in a situation where marriage breaks down, the husband and wife will separate, divorce, but they will find ways to cooperate for the sake of the children. So that's the idea of, it doesn't have to, the motivation for the mechila can differ. The idea of recognizing that it's a process. Sometimes you begin by saying, okay, I forgive you, but still harbor a grudge. Sometimes you forgive and are able to work together in a more utilitarian way. Sometimes you're able to then reconnect emotionally as well. And then maybe it does become completely forgiven and forgotten. As well as the idea of recognizing that at its baseline, though, it's an achievable process. Jewish law doesn't expect you to forgive overnight. It requires the first step of asking for forgiveness. It presents the opportunity to grant forgiveness. And remembering that granting forgiveness doesn't mean everything is, peachy all of a sudden. Everything is perfect. Just because we sort of think in absolutes. You think in terms of those sort of, you give the confession and the Hail Marys and you're done. There's expiation, that things are clean. Not necessarily. We'll sometimes give the example with regards to the terminology in Jewish law for forgiveness. There are a number of different terms. There is salicha, we ask God, forgive me. And there's also kapara from Yom Kippur, which means atonement. So what's the difference between forgiveness and atonement? Anyone want to venture a suggestion?
It's pretty obvious.
Okay, I don't know, maybe to you.
The person who did the wrong thing atones. It's
Okay.
their action. The forgiveness, and again, frankly, this whole notion of forgiveness, I think, is really obscuring and making things
See,
unclear.
I see. I think because you're defining it incorrectly. Forgiveness means that I am sorry, please forgive me. I sometimes give the example if you're taking one of these boards. Let's look at, let's take, for example, the idea of sin as a stain. Right, this is the idea of the sin. The idea of forgiveness is trying to wipe away the stain. The idea of atonement is you wipe the board clean once again. You can forgive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire thing has been forgotten and has been uprooted. There is a value, in, as we will continue to see, of recognizing what is the what is taking place here on a religious level. On a practical level, there is a benefit towards being asked for forgiveness. There's a benefit emotionally for getting the monkey off your back and granting the forgiveness. But on a spiritual level, there's still something more at play. And that, I think, that difference between forgiveness and atonement is one way to demonstrate. We're talking here about forgiveness. Grant the forgiveness, that doesn't mean we're done and over just yet. Because we still have to get to the heart of the matter, or to the soul of mechila, the soul of this forgiveness. And I think you look at page 62 on that learning exercise. A person should forgive because. So fill in the sentence.